Imagine a 5-gallon bucket just buried deep in the dense, damp woods of Vermont.
Yeah, just completely hidden.
Exactly. And inside that bucket, which is carefully sealed against the elements, there are zip ties, a stash of untraceable cash, and a loaded handgun.
Just sitting there in the dirt.
Right. It sits there entirely untouched under layers of snow and dirt through 2 brutal New England winters.
Wow.
And the man who dug the hole and buried that bucket lives 4,000 miles away in Alaska.
Which is just staggering logistics.
It really is. He lives a perfectly normal life. He runs a contracting business. He attends parent-teacher conferences. He goes to the local hardware store.
Right, he's just a regular guy.
Exactly. And he doesn't come back for that specific bucket for 2 full years.
I mean, that is the ultimate exercise in deferred gratification,
Yeah,
especially when applied to something profoundly dark.
absolutely.
The level of patience required to set a mechanism like that in motion and then simply walk away to resume a mundane existence, it defies almost everything we know about criminal impulsivity.
Which is exactly why we are framing today's deep dive very deliberately. I want to speak directly to you listening to this right now. You are tuning into a framework we call control studies.
Right.
We are not here to do a sensationalized horror story. We are not doing a true crime recap with dramatic music. And we definitely aren't here to gawk at the gory details.
No, not at all.
Our tone today is strictly clinical, strictly analytical, and entirely unsensational. We are treating this as a pure, objective case study.
Because it's the only way to actually learn from it.
Exactly. We are going to dissect how a real serial killer actually got caught, pinpoint the precise operational failures that dismantled his methodology, and analyze what a smarter, more strictly disciplined approach would have looked like.
And to do that effectively, we really have to strip away the emotional reaction to the events themselves.
Which is hard, obviously.
It is, yeah. The natural reaction is revulsion. But revulsion clouds analysis. We have to look at this the way an architect looks at a collapsed building,
Right, examining the structure.
Exactly. We are looking at a structural blueprint. And usually when you analyze a systemic failure, you're looking for an external stressor. You build a bridge, an unprecedented hurricane hits it, the beams buckle, and you say, well, the wind was too much.
Sure.
But in the architecture of criminal evasion, the hurricane is almost always internal.
That is such a good point. And that brings us to today's blueprint,
Right.
which belongs to a man named Israel Keyes.
Yes.
The mission of this deep dive is to examine a methodology that held flawlessly for a decade, a system that produced 0 forensic leads, 0 digital footprints, and 0 behavioral profiles for 10 years.
Which is practically unheard of.
It is. And then we're going to dive deep into the precise psychology of the single, solitary, broken rule that brought that entire architecture crashing down.
What's fascinating here is how vital this specific case study is to understanding the limits of discipline.
How so?
Well, if we establish the baseline of how these forensic analyses usually go, we see that most offenders, even the highly prolific ones, eventually fail because of vanity.
Right, they want the credit.
Exactly. They want the public to know how smart they are, so they taunt the press. Or they keep trophies in their homes that physically tie them to their victims.
Which is always a huge mistake.
Always. Or they simply lack basic operational security, leaving a trail of DNA, fingerprints, or digital exhaust. This case is entirely unique because Keyes built a system specifically designed to starve investigators of all those standard metrics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because you do not just wake up one day and suddenly possess the psychological capacity to build a perfect, invisible criminal architecture.
No, absolutely not.
To understand the system he built, we first have to understand the completely unconventional blank slate from which this architect started.
You really have to look at the developmental environment. A system like this is born from a baseline definition of normal that is fundamentally fractured from day one.
Let's start with the geography and the ideology of his early life. He was born in January 1978 in Cove, Utah. He was the second of 10 children.
A very large family.
Right. And this wasn't just a large rural family. His parents practiced a total uncompromising rejection of government institutions, public schooling, and conventional medicine.
Which is a massive level of isolation.
It gets more extreme. When he was 5 years old, the family relocated to Colville, Washington. But they didn't move into the town. They settled in deeply isolated woodland. They lived without electricity and without central heating.
The term off-grid gets thrown around pretty casually today, like to describe someone with solar panels or a backup generator.
Yeah, like a lifestyle trend.
Right. But we need to understand what this level of withdrawal actually means for human development. They were actively removing themselves from the social contract.
Wow.
This was a deep ideological withdrawal from mainstream American society.
And it only escalated from there. The sources indicate that the family eventually became involved with a white supremacist congregation called the Ark.
Which is just another layer of radicalization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which, regardless of the specific ideology, serves to completely sever whatever remaining tenuous ties they might have had to the outside world. They were existing in an absolute silo.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of childhood development, a child learns the boundaries of reality by bumping up against the systems of society.
Like guardrails.
Exactly. You go to a public school, you interact with teachers, you go to a pediatrician, you learn that your name is on a roster somewhere, you develop a sense of cause and effect within a community that is actively watching you.
Growing up the way he did is essentially growing up as a ghost.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Because he was kept entirely out of conventional systems, he learned incredibly early on how to move invisibly through a society that he wasn't technically a part of. I mean, he didn't even have a standardized paper trail.
Exactly. He is gaining an outsider's perspective on how systems operate. He can observe the town, the roads, the people, without ever leaving a footprint within those structures.
Right.
But the danger of that total isolation is the absence of societal checks and balances. When dark behavioral traits begin to manifest, there is no one there to intervene.
And those behaviors were definitely manifesting. The sources detail how he grew up hunting, which, is a normal survival skill in an off-grid environment. But he took it further.
Much further.
He began breaking into neighbors' homes, specifically to steal firearms.
Yeah.
Furthermore, there are multiple accounts of him torturing animals.
Yeah.
Now, in a normal environment, a teacher notices a behavioral shift. A school counselor intervenes. A pediatrician catches the warning signs.
Here, there is zero institutional oversight. He is essentially running covert operations, burglaries, animal cruelty, and learning that he can execute these dark impulses without facing any consequences from the outside world.
He's practicing.
He is. He is beta testing his ability to operate in secret.
Then comes the severing of the final tie. As a teenager, he abandons his family's extreme faith. And the reaction from his parents is absolute. He's evicted from the family home and completely cut off.
Just completely discarded.
Yes. His younger siblings were actually instructed never to speak to him again. So he is a teenager, entirely adrift, with no formal education, no societal integration, and absolutely no support system.
This is the crucial pivot point in the case study. He has lived a life characterized by chaotic isolation, extreme fringe ideology, and total disconnection.
Right.
So what does he do? He seeks out the exact opposite.
We jump to July 1998 in New York. He enlists in the United States Army.
Yeah.
I really want to pause on that contrast because it's staggering. You go from the ultimate anti-government, off-grid, feral childhood straight into the ultimate institutional, rules-based, highly regimented environment on the planet.
The military provided exactly what his developmental years lacked.
Structure.
Exactly. It provided him with formal training in precision, in operational planning, in logistics, and in working within a highly structured system.
Wow.
And the terrifying part is how well he assimilated.
He didn't just survive, he thrived, right?
He thrived. He served in the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment. He even completed the notoriously grueling Army Ranger training.
And he wasn't constantly bumping heads with authority, which is what you might naturally expect from someone raised entirely off-grid.
Right, you'd expect rebellion.
But his record was clean. The sources note one citation for driving under the influence. But beyond that, there were no major disciplinary issues. After 4 years, he received an honorable discharge. He completely absorbed the structure.
He absorbed it because he recognized its utility. The military gave him a methodology.
Wow.
It taught him how to assess a target, how to manage complex logistics over long distances, and how to maintain strict operational security. The core tragedy of this case study is that he took that institutional, taxpayer-funded training in systemic precision, and he spent the next decade applying it to a completely different objective in the civilian world.
He weaponized the logistics of the military against a civilian population that wasn't expecting it. Which leads us to the central question of this analysis. How does someone take military-grade operational planning and apply it to a civilian double life? I mean, how do you live next door to people for a decade and remain a total ghost?
You achieve it by constructing an architecture of evasion built entirely on the illusion of the ordinary.
Let's look at how he built that illusion. After his military service, he moves around a bit, spends some time in Neah Bay, Washington, and eventually settles in Anchorage, Alaska.
Right.
He builds a life. He starts a contracting and handyman business. He has a daughter. He pays his taxes. And when you look at the accounts from neighbors, clients, and people who interacted with him daily, they all use the exact same words: reliable, professional, and ordinary.
Ordinary is the most effective camouflage a predator can wear.
I want to push back on the concept of ordinary here, though,
Okay.
because for someone harboring the internal compulsions he had, being ordinary wasn't a natural state of being. It wasn't a personality trait. It must have been an active, exhausting, deliberate camouflage.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a performance art that requires sustained effort over years. Imagine the psychological toll of waking up every single day and putting on a costume of normalcy, specifically so the system doesn't look at you twice.
Your distinction is incredibly important. It was a performance and a highly disciplined one. He maintained that performance so that his actual methodology, his criminal architecture, could operate undetected in the background.
Right.
The FBI would later explicitly state that his approach was the most methodical of any American serial killer on record.
So let's get into the mechanics of that methodology. What were the actual rules he engineered to eliminate risk?
The rules were entirely designed to break the standard investigative playbook. Let's start with travel. The rule was to never fly into or out of small regional airports. He exclusively used major transport hubs.
Which makes sense when you think about the mathematics of surveillance.
Exactly.
If you fly into a regional airport that sees maybe 200 passengers a day, the staff at the rental car counter or the security checkpoint might remember your face.
They'll notice you.
But if you fly into O'Hare or SeaTac, you are just one of 80,000 faces that day. You become a statistic, a blip in an overwhelming data stream.
Precisely, you blend into the volume. Then, once he landed at a major hub, he rented cars. But the critical detail is that he rented them in his own name.
Wait, renting a car in his own name, doesn't that defeat the entire purpose of being a ghost?
You would think so.
If he's building a perfect system of evasion, why wouldn't he use a fake ID or an alias?
It's a great question. But using a fake ID introduces a variable of suspicion. If the ID is flagged, or if the rental agent notices an anomaly, the camouflage fails immediately.
Ah, I see.
There's nothing inherently suspicious about a professional contractor flying into a major city and renting a car in his own name. It's a completely innocent, fully documented act that happens millions of times a day.
Right, it doesn't trigger any alarms.
Exactly. The evasion happens in the application of that rental car. He would drive that vehicle hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away from the rental location, across state lines to commit the crime, and then drive it all the way back.
Wow.
The geographic disconnect between the paper trail and the crime scene is massive.
That brings us to another foundational rule, which shows an incredible understanding of technology for the late 2000s. He strictly left his mobile phone at home in Alaska.
We really need to dive into the mechanics of why that is so vital. Long before the general public truly understood that a mobile phone is essentially a passive tracking device, Keyes understood the architecture of cellular networks.
Right, because a phone doesn't just track you when you make a call.
No.
Even if it's just sitting in your pocket, it is constantly doing a digital handshake with the nearest cell towers to maintain a signal. It's triangulation.
Exactly.
If you have your phone on you, you are generating a continuous, passive, timestamped diary of your exact physical movements.
Exactly. By leaving his phone powered on at his house in Alaska, he was actively manufacturing a digital alibi.
That is chilling.
It is. If investigators ever did look his way, his digital footprint explicitly stated that he was sitting in his living room, even while he was physically driving a rental car 3 states away.
He also completely severed his financial footprint by operating entirely in cash while traveling for these crimes. No credit cards, no debit cards, no ATM withdrawals in the target states.
Which eliminates the other major investigative tool. When a crime occurs, detectives look for digital exhaust cell power bumps and financial transactions. Keyes provided neither.
But the rule that I find most staggering, because it goes against the very nature of serial offenses, is his victim selection.
Right.
He selected victims with absolutely zero shared characteristics.
This is how you systematically dismantle criminal profiling. Profiling relies on identifying patterns.
Right, like a type.
Exactly. If an offender targets people of a certain age bracket or a specific physical appearance or in a specific type of location, behavioral analysts can build a psychological profile of the suspect. They can predict where he might strike next.
But Keyes didn't do that.
Keyes explicitly and intentionally starved them of that data. He chose victims across entirely different demographics, ages, genders, and environments. He severed the psychological link that profilers rely on.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. All of those rules, the major hubs, the rental cars, the cash, the phone, those are all about getting to the target geography cleanly.
Right.
But how do you actually operate once you're there without leaving forensic evidence? How do you avoid the risk of traveling with weapons? The answer lies in the mechanism of the kill kits.
The logistics of the kill kits are what elevate this methodology from merely cautious to completely unprecedented.
We're talking about sealed containers, literally buckets from hardware stores, that he would load with handguns, ammunition, cash, zip ties, and supplies.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't just pack them in his luggage. He would bury these buckets in remote locations across the country, sometimes years in advance of ever using them.
Let's analyze why this is so devastatingly effective from a forensic standpoint.
Okay.
When investigators are working a homicide, they are looking for the intersection of three variables: the offender, the weapon, and the geography.
Right.
If you try to bring a weapon through TSA on an airplane, you generate a massive record. If you drive a weapon across the country, you risk a traffic stop. If you buy a weapon in the town where you plan to commit the crime, you create a point-of-sale record.
But by utilizing prepositioned caches, he completely decouples those variables.
He essentially creates a forensic firewall. The weapon arrives in the state entirely separately from the man years prior.
Wow.
The man arrives completely disconnected from the crime's geography, appearing as a normal tourist or businessman, and the supplies are already waiting for him in the dirt.
It's terrifying.
There is no forensic trail because the components of the crime, the intent, the tools, and the location, never travel together. They only intersect for the briefest, most violent moment, and then he scatters them again.
It is a dark, perfect equation. But in control studies, we know that a system is only theoretical until it is applied in the real world.
Exactly.
You can draw up the perfect play on a chalkboard, but you have to see how it survives contact with reality. So let's look at the proof of concept.
Yeah.
Let's look at a confirmed application of this methodology where it functioned flawlessly.
To see the architecture at work, we have to examine the events surrounding June 2011.
This is the Courier case in Essex, Vermont.
Yeah.
And I want to walk through the timeline carefully, because the timeline is where the terrifying patience of this system is truly revealed.
The patience is key here.
The execution doesn't begin in 2011. The operation begins in 2009. Keyes takes a trip to Vermont. It appears to be a pure reconnaissance and logistics trip. During that trip, a full 2 years before the crime is committed, he buries one of his sealed buckets in the region. And then he leaves. He goes back to Anchorage.
I want to pause on the psychology of that 2-year gap. For 24 months, that sealed bucket sits in the Vermont dirt.
Just waiting.
Think about the restraint, the total lack of impulsivity required to put a violent plan in motion, bury the supplies, and then simply walk away and resume your life as a father and a handyman for over 700 days.
Then, June 2011 finally arrives, the execution phase. Keyes flies from Alaska to Chicago. He uses a major hub, just like the rule dictates.
Yeah.
He rents a vehicle as his own name in Chicago, and then he drives from Illinois all the way to Vermont. He retrieves the kit from the earth, and shortly after midnight on June 8th, he targets the home of Bill Courier and Lorraine Courier, a married couple, late 40s, mid-50s.
And again, applying his rule of victim selection, this couple is completely random. They have absolutely zero connection to him. There are no shared acquaintances, no financial ties, nothing that a detective could ever link back to Alaska.
The operational security during the event itself is incredibly tight. Before he even attempts entry, he locates and severs the exterior telephone line to the house,
Which is very methodical.
This disables any alarm system communication and prevents the victims from making an emergency call. He breaches the attached garage, moves through the home with extreme speed, and restrains them both using the zip ties from his pre-positioned kit.
He also introduces another layer of variable manipulation. He finds a handgun inside the courier's own home and takes it.
Right.
He doesn't load the victims into his rental car because that would risk transferring fiber evidence or DNA into a vehicle tied to his real name. Instead, he loads them into their own vehicle.
Wow.
He drives them to a nearby abandoned farm property that he had already scouted in advance. That is where the murders take place.
After the execution, he drives back, cleans up, returns his rental car in Chicago, flies back to Alaska, and literally goes to work the next day.
Which brings us to the perspective of the investigators. What was the result of this massive logistical undertaking?
The result was a perfect void.
A total vacuum of actionable data. Because he used the victim's own car and transported them to a secondary abandoned property, the primary crime scene, their house yielded almost nothing.
Nothing at all.
There were no bodies found. There was no massive struggle that left behind pools of blood or biological evidence.
In fact, initially, the local authorities were so starved of evidence that they treated the situation as a potential voluntary departure. They thought the couple might have just packed up and left.
Which proves the methodology.
The system worked exactly as engineered. There was zero forensic connection, no digital trail, and no geographical logic pointing 1,000 miles away to an ordinary contractor in Anchorage.
The only reason we possess the granular mechanical details of this operation is because of the clinical confessions Keyes provided much later, after he was apprehended for a completely different, catastrophic error.
And the tone of those confession sessions is a study in itself. When you read the transcripts, he didn't confess to unburden his soul.
Not at all.
There was no emotional breakdown, no remorse, no seeking of forgiveness.
He analyzed his own crimes the way an engineer reviews a bridge collapse, or the way a software developer conducts a postmortem on a failed code deployment.
Exactly.
He discussed what was suboptimal. He talked about specific distances, timelines, and logistical friction points, and openly discussed how he planned to refine the process for the next operation.
What stands out to me in those transcripts is how he managed the interrogators. He wasn't submitting to their authority. He was actively managing the flow of data.
What's fascinating here is the psychological dynamic of leverage and control that he maintained even while in custody. Over the course of several months, he provided investigators with more than 40 hours of recorded interviews. He would describe his methods in intense, granular detail, explaining the kill kits, the rental cars, the logistics. But he strategically withheld the most crucial pieces of information, the identities and the specific locations of his other victims.
He understood the interrogation dynamic perfectly.
Yeah.
He knew that the moment he gave them the names and the locations, his utility dropped to zero, and he lost his power.
Exactly.
He used that withheld information as leverage to dictate the terms of his confinement, to get specific demands met.
He even demonstrated his willingness to punish the system. At one point, against his strict conditions, his name was leaked to the press in connection with the Vermont case.
Oh, wow.
When that happened, he didn't throw a tantrum. He simply shut down the flow of information. He halted cooperation completely to prove that he was still the one controlling the valve.
So we have established the absolute baseline of this deep dive. For a decade, this man is a ghost. He has built an impenetrable architecture of evasion. He has proven that the architecture works flawlessly in the real world.
Flawless.
The FBI considers his methodology unprecedented. So, what specific failure brought the whole thing crashing down? How does the invisible man finally get caught?
The ghost gets caught because he made the conscious decision to rip the load-bearing pillar out of his own system. We move now to the fracture.
We'd advance the timeline to February 1st, 2012. The location is Anchorage, Alaska. This is his home turf.
Right.
He drives to a small Common Grounds coffee kiosk on Tudor Road in the evening. He abducts a young woman working the Standard, an 18-year-old named Samantha Koenig. He forces her into his truck, drives her to his own property, eventually kills her, and leaves her body in a shed in his own backyard.
Yeah.
And the very next day, he boards a flight to New Orleans to go on a pre-booked 2-week family cruise in the Gulf of Mexico.
We need to put this event under the microscope and clinically dissect exactly what happened here, because the deviation from his established methodology is staggering.
It makes no sense.
In a single violent act, he shattered almost every fundamental rule he had spent a decade rigidly enforcing.
Let's go through the failures. The most glaring one. He operated locally. He committed an abduction and a murder in Anchorage, completely destroying his rule of massive geographic dispersal.
It cannot be overstated how catastrophic that is. The geographic disconnect was his primary shield.
Right.
Furthermore, he targeted someone in his own operational and social area. He was a known entity in this city. He had a professional reputation, a recognizable vehicle, and regular routines. The risk of being recognized by a passing motorist or having his specific truck spotted on a local security camera was astronomically higher than in his previous operations.
And the third failure, which proved to be the fatal one, he created an ongoing obligation that physically and digitally tied him to the crime long after the event itself.
This is the critical failure of the entire system. His methodology was entirely based on severance. Arrive, execute, leave, and sever all ties. Never look back.
Right, be a ghost.
But here, he returns from his family cruise in mid-February, and instead of walking away, he engages in a desperate, incredibly messy follow-up operation.
It's honestly hard to comprehend the sudden drop in sophistication. It's like watching a grandmaster chess player suddenly start eating the pieces.
That's a very vivid way to describe it.
He returns to Anchorage. The young woman has been dead for 2 weeks in his shed. He decides to stage a ransom photograph.
Yeah, this part is just...
He actually sews her eyes open to create the macabre illusion that she's still alive, takes a picture of her holding a current newspaper, and then on February 24th, he leaves a ransom note in a city park.
Right.
He demands $30,000, and he demands that the money be deposited directly into a bank account connected to the victim's own debit card.
Let's trace the digital footprint this specific demand creates, because it is the exact opposite of leaving your mobile phone powered on at home to create an alibi.
Exactly.
By demanding the ransom be accessible through the victim's debit card, he is forcing himself to physically interact with the digital banking grid.
Right. And, it's fascinating because this concept, an offender studying historical failures to perfect a system only to have it unravel, is something you usually only see in fiction.
That's true.
There's actually a thriller on Kindle right now called Adam that explores this exact premise of a killer correcting past methodologies. But Keyes was doing it in real life, and now he's making the exact rookie mistakes he designed his system to avoid.
Right, he's undoing his own work.
He leaves Alaska and starts traveling south. And because he wants the ransom money, he uses her debit card at ATMs.
And we all know how ATMs function. ATMs have high-resolution cameras.
And timestamps.
More importantly, ATMs log the exact time, the exact location, and the routing data of every single transaction. When he inserts that card, the clearinghouse processes the request, and it instantly alerts the FBI, who are actively monitoring the account.
Suddenly, the ghost who only operated in untraceable cash, who severed all geographic and digital ties, is voluntarily creating a brightly lit, time-stamped, high-resolution geographic trail for federal authorities.
He's drawing a map right to himself.
He uses a stolen card in Alaska. Then the system pings in Arizona. Then New Mexico. Then Texas.
This system has completely collapsed. He is broadcasting his exact latitude and longitude to federal authorities with every withdrawal.
And the culmination of all this is incredibly anticlimactic for a guy who viewed himself as a master strategist.
Yeah.
March 13th, 2012, Lufkin, Texas.
Right.
It wasn't a dramatic FBI tactical raid on a compound. It was a routine minor traffic stop by a state trooper in the parking lot of a local restaurant.
It's a normal traffic stop.
The trooper pulled him over, noticed cash in the vehicle that was visibly stained with dye from a bank robbery Keyes had clumsily committed during this chaotic road trip, and they searched the vehicle. And what do they find sitting in the car? The victim's debit card and her mobile phone.
The variables were no longer decoupled. The forensic firewall was gone. The man, the physical evidence, and the direct digital link to the crime were all sitting together in the same driver's seat.
It was over.
Extradition back to Alaska followed swiftly, and in early April, after negotiating terms, he finally disclosed the location of the young woman's remains in a frozen lake north of the city.
So this brings us to the ultimate question of this deep dive, the core of control studies.
This raises an important question indeed.
What does this all mean? Why did a master architect of evasion deliberately burn his own house down?
The FBI behavioral analyst spent months trying to answer this exact question during the interrogations. Why did he abandon the rules? Why operate locally?
And what did he say?
The partial answer he provided during the confession transcripts was strictly financial. He stated that he needed the money. His contracting business was supposedly struggling. It wasn't generating sufficient income to maintain his lifestyle and his travel. And the ransom was supposed to be a purely economic solution.
Okay, I have to push back on that heavily. I just do not buy the financial motive as the root cause.
Why not?
Financial need explains our robbery. It explained holding up a convenience store or breaking into a warehouse or even the bank robbery he committed in Texas. It absolutely does not explain throwing out a decade of strict life-or-death operational security to abduct and murder someone in your own backyard.
That's a very fair point.
You don't need to shatter your entire forensic architecture just to get 30 grand.
Your skepticism is entirely validated by the psychological reality of the case. The ransom wasn't the motive for the crime. The ransom was a messy, post-event improvisation to justify the fact that he had already broken his rules. The initial choice to abduct the young woman from the kiosk was the fatal fracture. The debit card, the ATM trail, the ransom note, all of that was just the chaotic consequence of that initial catastrophic choice. To understand why he made that choice, we have to look deeper. We have to introduce a concept we can call the forensic psychology of the broken rule.
This is exactly what we are here for. Talk to me about the broken rule.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to understand that his system didn't fail because it was outsmarted from the outside.
Right.
The FBI didn't crack the code of the kill kits. The system was mechanically sound. It collapsed entirely from within. During one of the most revealing moments of the interrogations, Keyes admitted that he had actually set a specific internal condition for himself that night in February before he approached the coffee stand.
Right. He told the investigators, if the young woman at the kiosk has her own vehicle parked nearby, I'm just going to rob the stand for the cash and leave.
Exactly. That was the rule he laid down to protect his system. A vehicle complicates the abduction. It adds variables, so the rule was, if there's a car, just take the money. But she didn't have her own vehicle parked there.
So the rule applied.
Yes. So what does he do? He decides, in that exact pressurized moment, that the condition he set for himself is no longer applicable. He reinterprets his own rule to serve his dark compulsion.
It's the illusion of the exception. Let me offer an analogy here because it feels like looking at an air-gapped computer network.
Okay, let's hear it.
You can build the most impenetrable cybersecurity firewall on Earth. You can disconnect the server from the internet entirely, lock it in a vault, and make it mechanically perfect.
Right.
But that system still completely falls apart the second the system's architect gets bored, decides just this once, and plugs an infected USB drive directly into the mainframe.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the vulnerability. It highlights the conflict between the two different operating modes of the human mind. Keyes operated in two distinct modes. In planning mode, sitting in his living room in Alaska, months in advance of a trip, the rules are absolute. The variables must be disconnected, the phone stays home, the hubs must be major, the logic is cold and mathematical.
But then there's the other mode.
Right. In execution mode, sitting in his truck in Anchorage on a dark night in February, the dark compulsion rises up and it pushes violently against the boundary of the logical rule.
This is the concept of restraint fatigue, isn't it? For Keyes, the discipline existed specifically because he knew the moment of compulsion would feel like an exception.
Exactly.
He built the rules to protect his physical freedom from his own psychological urges. But when he finally accepted that framing, when his brain successfully whispered, this time is different, this victim is convenient, the rule doesn't apply today, the entire 10-year system became instantly irrelevant.
The person who designed the brilliant rule and the person who recklessly broke the rule were operating from the exact same mind. What the Anchorage case perfectly demonstrates is the ultimate ceiling of any system built on top of a compulsion. A logical system can redirect a compulsion. It can delay it. It can contain it for extended periods, even a full decade, as we saw here.
Right.
But a rule that exists purely in service of managing a compulsion will eventually, inevitably, be reinterpreted in the compulsion's favor.
And the aftermath of that reinterpretation is total destruction.
Yeah.
On December 2nd, 2012, before he could ever stand trial, Keyes committed suicide in his Anchorage jail cell.
And in keeping with his need for control, he left behind a highly curated, deeply disturbing final image.
He did.
Investigators found 11 skulls drawn in his own blood on paper hidden beneath his bed.
That is just...
Yeah. The FBI behavioral analysts concluded that those 11 skulls likely represent his total number of victims, though, as we've discussed, only 3 were ever officially confirmed due to his operational security.
Right.
He left behind partial transcripts, hidden caches that are still buried out there in the dirt somewhere, and the legacy of a system that worked flawlessly until it didn't.
So, as we synthesize this immense case study for today's Control Studies deep dive, what is the ultimate takeaway?
What do you think?
When we look at the operational failures of systemic evasion, The mechanical mechanism of capture always varies. The source material notes this beautifully. A deleted floppy disk destroyed one notorious killer. A tracked debit card destroyed this one. A traffic ticket destroys another.
Right.
The tool of the downfall always changes. But the psychological pattern is identical.
The pattern is the inevitable breaking point of discipline. Any discipline that exists in a state of constant tension with a dark compulsion has a structural ceiling.
It's just a matter of time.
It is never, ever a question of if the internal pressure will hit that ceiling and shatter it. It is only a question of when.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to take away today.
Consider the systems and the rules that you build in your own life. We all have them, obviously on a much more mundane scale. Rules to contain our worst habits, our minor impulses, our procrastinations, our diets. Are those rules genuinely keeping you in check? Or are they just waiting for the day your brain successfully convinces you that just this once is a perfectly valid exception?
That is a haunting question, and it really circles back to what we started with. We constantly look for the external hurricane that knocks the bridge down, but the truth is the stressor is almost always internal. The concrete rots from the inside out.
Well said.
Before we wrap up this analysis, I want to briefly remind you one more time that the novel titled Atom, which fictionally explores these exact themes of systemic methodology and its ultimate breaking points, is available on Amazon Kindle. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into the architecture of evasion and the forensic psychology of the broken rule. We'll leave you to process that. Stay analytical.